So it's hard to talk seriously about finance without a conversation around fintech, the intersection of finance and technology. And we really struggled with how to define it and how to address it because it means different things to different people. And it impacts our industry in so many ways. So what do? We turned to our good friend Jere Doyle, and more about Jere in a minute. But Jere told us that we should think about it as the use of technology for disruption and innovation. And so we have a panel that we put together today that Jere will describe, but we have disruptors, we have some disrupted, and we have some who are thinking about both. And no one who's been in the innovation economy in and around Boston probably, I don't know how you can do that without knowing Jere. Jere's a terrific friend of the school. He runs the Shea Center for Entrepreneurship here at Boston College. I'm going to skip the rest of his intro and turn it over to Jere.
Thanks, Dan. And when I went to research what to talk about today, literally there's conferences that are 3-day conferences dedicated to fintech, and we got 39 minutes and 13 seconds. I do talk very quickly, and my panelists do as well. So we're going to go real quick with the introductions. But we have a great panel today to talk about fintech, the disruption that's going on. $13 billion was invested in new companies last year alone in fintech around both wealth tech and capital markets tech. 13 billion backing something like 800 or so companies. So there's a lot going on in the world, a lot going on with disrupting. And so we're trying to figure out today where the disruption is most effective, what's real, what isn't real, how are we going to be affected in here, where are the jobs that are at risk, where are the opportunities, and hopefully where we can invest. The panelists we have here are phenomenal. First, to my left is Adam Broun. Adam's the COO of Kensho, which is building a machine learning and analytics platform for customers like the U.S. government, Goldman Sachs, other investment banks, trading platforms. And I'm a colleague of Adam's at a couple of angel groups here in Boston. So he's not only a COO of a leading fintech company, but he's also an active early stage investor. Next to Adam is Larry Restieri. Larry is the partner and head of digital strategy at Goldman Sachs. He's responsible for Honest Dollar and ICO, which we'll hear a little bit more today. And I believe he's also responsible for our third panelist to the left, which is William Hurley, or better known as Whirly. And Whirly is our entrepreneur. You were just telling me, in addition to Honest Dollar, which you founded, and then now Goldman has acquired, you've had 3 other companies just in the last couple of years that you founded and sold. You've been involved with 18 different startups that have some kind of liquidity event. And so you really are a serial entrepreneur. So you are the disruptor, and I think we'll have to hear how that's worked as you now rolling into Goldman, but it'll be pretty interesting. So we're going to break the session down into kind of 2 parts. We're going to talk first about wealth tech, right? So there's so many things in fintech we could talk about. We picked 2 subject matters. One is wealth tech. So things like advisors, robo-advisors, self-service platforms. What's happening on the investment side of stuff? And that's going to be kind of the first part of our panel. And then the second part we'll talk about is the capital markets tech, and so the back office and stuff with the investment banks and things like that. And then maybe if we have time, touch on blockchain and ledger technology. And we'll finish up with just basically trying to figure out where we're going with this, what the future looks like. So let's start with the wealth tech side. Early, you started Honest Dollar. Talk to us a little bit about what's happening in wealth tech and why so much disruption.
So first, I want to start. Thanks for having me. But I always avoid the word disruption. I think of it more as displacement, right? When you disrupt something, you come in, I muddy up the water for me, I muddy it up for the incumbents. A lot of times there's no money there, right? And there can be a lot of confusion. You can start off regulatory changes and all manner of different things. So I think of it more along the lines of displacement. And what's happening is simply that technology is doing the job it's done in many other industries for many other years, right? There are jobs that existed 10 years ago that don't exist today. There will be jobs that exist today that don't exist in 10 years. So in the wealth tech, it's just technology being applied to do a lot of things. At Honest Dollar, the goal wasn't to disrupt an industry. It was to displace the retirement industry by looking at an area that was not underserved, but completely not served. There were 70 million people in 401k plans. There are almost 100 million total with no access to any kind of plan at all. And so it was, how do we use the technology to get into a market that many had tried for years and years to get into, but failed? And were we at that right inflection point where that technology was going to take off and enable that?
So what? Explain a little bit more about what Honest Dollar does, and how, and how what you've seen is from a traction standpoint since you started.
Sure. So we started with small businesses. We said, look, you go and you read the 401k averages book, and it tells you there's a 10-person company with $100,000 in assets, and this is how much they're going to pay for a retirement plan. And then you go look at the numbers, and you say, well, small businesses, the automotive shop, the restaurant, they don't really offer 401ks to their employees. And the fact is that as the owner, the reality of it is, I have $90,000 in savings, and then those other 9 employees have $10,000 amongst all of them. And so I don't want a 401k plan because I don't want to subsidize their plan out of my personal savings. So generally, I elect not to offer a plan. So we thought, well, there's a lot of legal changes happening, a lot of state and federal government initiatives to start getting, if you have more than 20 employees, 25 employees, whatever the number is, depending on where you're at, let's go ahead and make you give some sort of retirement plan, because there's a savings crisis in this nation, right? The average American hits a $400 expense, they're insolvent. Right? So what happened is, years ago, the payday loan industry popped up out of that, and then now that's created, even more, kind of exacerbated the problem. And so this is something everybody should be paying very close attention to. And we thought, how do we solve it? So we took IRAs and we assembled simple and traditional IRAs in a way that a employer could sign up in 90 seconds or so on the website. We tie into their back-end system, and then we can go out and contact the employees. So they can subsidize this. Instead of selling it like a financial services model, we sell it like a Google app. So $3, $5 a head, whatever the case may be, depending on discounts and other incentives. And then it's a software play. So the employer doesn't have to do a lot of work. They don't have to worry about it. It's an IRA. If the employee quits, they don't have to worry about anything related to the regulations around the plan. They don't have to have any involvement with the plan or any responsibility for the employee choices. That quickly led us into a very new and exciting market, which is where we have primarily been focused, which is 1099 workers. If you look at the activities on Capitol Hill, they'll say, well, we need Uber and Lyft and everybody to make 1099 employees, W-2 employees, so that they can get benefits. And the danger of that assumption is you're assuming that by becoming a W-2 employee, I get benefits for free, but I pay for those benefits, right? Sometimes disproportionately compared to other benefit packages. And so we thought, well, why can't we just take our software and make a retirement benefit that's very simple, very cheap, again, $5 a month for 1099 workers. And so we launched that product with Lyft. We continued to expand into other 1099 businesses, and that became a very fast-growing part of the business. So there's about 56 million people that are 1099 workers, and the majority of them don't actually have any kind of coherent plan. So it's a really good business to be in.
So Larry, you're sitting at Goldman, and how'd you find out about Honest Dollar? Why? What was the strategy around that your bank had, and you had to to acquire a company like Hurley's?
Sure. So I guess to use your terms earlier, not to disagree with you, I use disruption just as since Jere used it, but I kind of sit as in some ways as a disruptor in terms of what we're doing with Honest Dollar and other businesses, but also a disruptee in that it's there's a lot of change going on in our business, and I say to people all the time that I think when I think about our business, in financial services, I would argue that this is probably the point of greatest change. I could argue since like the 40s, or since like the 40 Act. This is dramatic change undergoing our business. And that's a combination of regulation and technology. And as Hurley alluded to, what technology is doing is allowing just things that humans used to do or whatever the process was, and is doing them more efficiently, or that's a large part of what's happening. So that's where a lot of disruption is happening. That's where, look, a lot of jobs are changing. When I think about the couple of businesses that kind of fall under my purview, we have a business called ACO. ACO is a very traditional business. Basically, we are the largest executive counseling business across the United States. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of Goldman Sachs, but we provide financial counseling, so think of it as financial planning for corporate executives to a large portion of the Fortune 1000. And it's a very good business. It's grown since we acquired it in 2003 consistently. It's a very, very good business, but it's very labor intensive. It's very hands-on. That's just the nature of the business. Then you look at, as we think about how do we expand that business and how do we grow it, well, part of it is how do we go deeper into the company? How do we cover more employees at a company other than just the top 200 executives at a major corporation? The only way you can do that is really with a digital solution, to have some scale in what you do. So we're always looking for, how can we do that? What's an interesting way to do it? And then to take Honest Dollar, if you want to really take the extreme, you look at a lot of businesses now, it's actually no longer, even at big corporations, it's no longer just the companies that are serviced by whatever the corporate plan may be. It's actually, they have contract workers too that fall, like, so you take a company like Amazon, they have a whole slew of contract employees. So Honest Dollar is kind of coming at it from the other way. So for us, it creates an interesting way to kind of come at our businesses in wealth management. And one of the challenges for someone in my seat is how we take someone like Hurley, which is more of an entrepreneurial culture, in a startup way, and try to marry it with a much more traditional business, and that's something we work on every day.
How's that gone? I mean, is that a?
It's I don't know if we'd have the same answer, but that's it. Look, I think it's gone well, but I'm not going to tell you it's not without its challenges. And I think when I think about some of the things we're trying to do at ACO in terms of trying to digitize some of the business, and this goes not just within ACO, there's also within our investment management division, within GSAM. When I think about some of the things we're trying to do, we have one culture within Goldman Sachs, and frankly, I remember going down to Austin to visit Honest Dollar, and just I was like, literally, we need some of these people and we need some of this DNA actually back at 200 West Street at our headquarters, because they think differently, right? I mean, the problem that, look, we all have is we just, or certainly those of us that have been in the business a long time, you kind of just accept that this is how things are done because this is how things have always been done. And we have a way of doing things, so how do you change a little bit of that culture? And part of it is you need fresh blood, you need fresh ideas. But that doesn't mean it's not without its, challenges.
Look, I'll be happy to comment on this. Maybe he doesn't want it. Maybe that makes him nervous when I say that. But I have been a part of a lot of acquisitions. Both when I was at IBM, I was on an acquisition committee, so bringing startups in. I've been on both sides of it, right? And traditionally what happens in acquisition is you acquire for a market or a tech. Every once in a while there's acqui-hire. Several people in the media had asked me, so did Goldman Sachs acqui-hire you? And I was like, oh no, none of us would ever be employable at that company. So I was like, I can assure you it was not an acqui-hire. They had 250,000 candidates for interns. They hired 1,000 of them. I don't know that we would have even been included in that. But we have a different viewpoint. We have a different DNA. We have a different technology. In the same, in about a year from July to July of 2015 to 2016, I transacted 3 companies, one to Accenture, one to Goldman Sachs, and one to Zynga, right? In the case of Zynga, it's already just been absorbed and kind of disappeared. In the case of Accenture, the brand's been gone, the technology's been kind of spread apart. And to Goldman's credit, this is truly a marriage, right? We wanted to do this deal as much as they did because this is the misnomer, right? We all look at it and say, oh, the big company is scared, or there's a displacement, or this or that, and so therefore their reaction is to acquire this startup, right? Or the startup is this and this and that. We don't look at it as for what it is. We needed Goldman as much as they needed us. Just like Larry talks about taking our DNA and putting it there. We're in finance. We're in a very heavily regulated space. We're technologists who haven't done this before. We need some of that DNA in our company, and honestly, we need some of that credibility. If you're growing very quickly and you start talking about signing, millions of customers instead of thousands of customers, people at these large companies, at these Amazons, like you mentioned, or FedEx or whatever, they want to know your balance sheet. They want to know where you're coming from. They want to, being like, well, it's a startup. We took $3 million in seed funding, and all doesn't really sell for that, right? So there was this kind of perfect storm, this perfect timing of both parties needing the same thing from each other. And to the credit, it's went well so far. It's never going to be smooth. Anybody who says, oh yeah, it just worked out perfectly, that's not how these things work. And I've been through dozens of them, right? But it's been the best one I've been a part of, and I'm very happy to be a part of it.
So let's stay on that for a second, and maybe Adam, you can kind of give your perspective here. 836 companies were backed by VCs last year for $13 billion in the fintech space, right? What are those 836 all going to get integrated into the big banks and into the big trading companies, and that's how we're going to change the culture, like you talked about, Larry? I mean, you were at Credit Suisse, right? Now you have your own company, Kensho, right here at Harvard Square. Is that the strategy? Is that what we're going to see over the next 5 years? It's just a lot of these acquisitions, of which some won't work, but most will work? Or how are we going to change the culture? Or does it need to be changed?
So of course you'll see a mix. Look, regulation for the industry is both an enemy and, frankly, a big defensive mechanism against insurgent companies. Of those 836, there are a bunch that are just bad ideas. There are a lot of bad ideas in fintech, let's face it. There are also a huge number of missed opportunities because the industry is pretty complex. It has a lot of dark and dusty corners that have yet to feel the breath of fresh technology come into them. But people coming from outside the industry don't know about them. How many people outside the industry understand the ins and outs of trade finance, let's say, or business leasing? And these are somewhat old line businesses, very large, very profitable, very important for the economy, but where technology really has not changed or transformed the business in any way. So you have a lot of these startups that are looking at consumer finance. Some of those are very important. Some, frankly, are pretty superficial. Most of those will die. The ones that are pretty important, like Honest Dollar, which is actually driving services to, it's truly disruptive. I don't like the word, but it is in the sense that it's taking people who are underserved, people who are not getting services today, and creating a way for them to have services, which is the classic definition of disruption in the Clay Christian sense of the word. And those will either grow to be very profitable, cash-generating companies in their own right. They will merge where eventually competition comes along and you need scale because margins start to get compressed, or they will get acquired, or they'll become part of consortia models. And look, none of these things are new. You can take a company like Market, which started out pricing CDS, credit default swaps, and just taking the prices from all the banks and publishing those. That's a classic consortium model where the banks all put money in and eventually spun out as its own very successful public company. So this arc of narrative for financial technology companies is not new. It's been going on for decades. The things that are new are the barriers to entry, the same technology trends that have enabled innovation across lots of industries, cloud computing and so on, and the emergence of machine learning and standardized software stacks and all of those kinds of things. So what's different is there are more of them. More of them will fail, some will succeed, and they will be more deeply transformative over a long period of time.
So just one thing to add to what Adam's saying. So I think in a lot of these things, sometimes you find that there are like 3 companies that do all something similar, so only one may survive. The market just decides who the winner is, and that's just how it happens. But one of the things exciting about what I think a lot of these startups can do is they can focus on a niche in the business that, me as someone in the business, I may complain about constantly for years, but when I think about our budget, we're never going to put the budget to fixing this one little problem because it's just not at the top of our, my priority list. What a lot of times these businesses can do is they can devote resources to what is one niche and then it creates some scale. They can actually create the efficiency that that needs to be done, but me with a big budget still won't finance because I have to manage that budget. So I mean, but I think that's where the exciting things that are happening.
Another thing that I often talk about is I think the finance industry and especially banks have suffered what I call a lost decade since the financial crisis, where they were forced by regulators, by the market, to turn inward, to focus on regulatory issues, compliance issues, fixing the balance sheet, dealing with stability, addressing all of the causes, all of the problems we saw in 2007, 2008. Very understandable. But the result of that is starvation of resources to innovative technologies, particularly in the front offices, a loss of skills. It used to be that if you were a technologist coming out of a university, going to a bank was one of the highest and best uses of your, a great career option. And that has not been the case for the past 10 years. You'd rather go to work for Facebook or Google or a startup like us. It's beginning to come back, but the banks have frankly woken up after 10 years and gone, like, the world has changed. We've been internally focused. They're starting now to look externally and therefore starting to be more bold and more innovative again, but there's some catching up to do.
Okay, so
One thing I was just going to add, I think for some of the fintechs out there, I do think, so for the entrepreneurs in the room, one thing that they do have to be careful of a little bit is thinking about what your exit might be, just because at the end, like some fintechs that are, I think, actually pretty good right now could be knocked out of business as some of the bigger incumbents get in and can get scale pretty quickly. And I would argue that there's some segments you're seeing this, whereas some other companies, it may make sense to sell sooner because there's a market for you at a certain size. Once you get too big, we're not going to buy. I mean, I'm just saying the market of potential buyers leaves, and it allows other companies to come in and acquire them.
All right, so let's look at the next couple of years then. Where are the big, great companies? What you said there's some, the 800 and something that started last year, there's a lot of bad ones. What are the good ones? Where are the opportunities right now? And what are we going to see if these banks have been kind of laying low for the last decade and not putting their money in innovation? We've had this innovation economy going on the side. You now have a whole bunch of opportunities. What are we going to see? If we sat down here a year from now? Where are the big ideas? The winners?
I'll turn to World.
Well,
he's our idea
obviously,
guy.
We already know about Honest Dollar.
Right.
What's the next?
No, I think, these 800 companies, both, my fellow panelists made great points. You're looking at, first of all, a lot of them are bad ideas. I was very glad to hear you say that. I say that all the time, and entrepreneurs get mad. I'll be speaking at an entrepreneurial conference in California tomorrow, and I'll say that, and people are like, oh, like my idea's not bad. But it's like, everybody says 90% of startups fail. And it's like, that's because 90% of those are stupid ideas. Like, I'm sorry, that's just the reality. So it's good to hear somebody else say that. And what Larry said is true. So you take the 800, you cut out 837, you cut out 700 of them, and then you say, okay, now these companies are actually across maybe 4 or 5 areas, right? And only one will win, or maybe 2 will win. So I think that in the next 2 years, you're going to see the big impact be in companies getting in and around regulatory systems, using technology. So companies that do, I don't want to talk about companies in specific because I don't want to, now that I'm at Goldman Sachs, I don't want to endorse anybody, right?
Good.
But see, that compliance training worked. So, but what I will say is, I see 3 kind of areas. So companies that are going into these underserved markets that before weren't accessible. So things where there's low credit scores and low amounts of savings and just areas that weren't interesting to big banks because it would take so much to get in there that it doesn't work as a business model, right? And everybody says, oh, the big bank doesn't want to help the little person because of this or that. It's like, it's very realistic to understand the dynamics of getting into that space. So companies that do that will do well. The second group, companies that basically change the way they address regulatory compliance, right? So what I mean by that is, so for example, we got into retirement, but instead of going to a 401k with all of that burden, we decided to use IRAs. And because they were IRAs and we could do softwares and we could do different things, with interacting with individuals that made it different than interacting with an actual business entity, right? So companies that get kind of creative with that. Don't step outside of the bounds of regulatory compliance, but find new ways to adhere to it that's better, faster, cheaper. And the third area, I think, is, I do see every year, I think you can tell there are fewer and fewer advisors right? It's something I've talked about for a long time. And that's not to say that we don't need advisors, but as I say, you have fewer of them registering, you have more and more technology and self-service models and things. So I think that third area will be in getting that financial advice. And machine learning will be a big part of that, obviously. The robo-advisor thing, I'm a very big critic of. That's an awesome buzzword, but that doesn't exist. There's no automated intelligence on the other side telling me what to do. The fact that I can write a small shell script to trade upon certain things or whatever does not make it some form of intelligence. But things going in that direction, I think, will do very well because people have went from, just look at the last year and a half, in the last, call it 16 months, you've went from, I won't put a camera and a microphone in my home or office to, I've got an Amazon Alexa or a Google Home. Apple this week on Monday just announced their new Siri speaker, so it's like people are starting to embrace these technologies and to trust them. Now if you go and you ask your Google Home, hey, what is the weather like? You don't then go turn on the TV or go look it up and say, oh, okay, well, it's not going to rain today because it said it wasn't going to rain. People will take that same behavior in the next 24 months and they will start to say, what should I do in this or that financial situation, and it will tell them based on either a variety of big data analysis or some machine learning across that data, et cetera, et cetera.
Can I add one? I think those are great. Well, I would add one though as a category, and I'm only partly talking my book here, which is companies that help us all make sense of the world better.
Absolutely.
And whether you're an investment manager or you're a banker or you're just a human trying to operate in the world or you're a government. Particularly in finance, we're still operating in a world where a traditional active manager is working off of company financials and earnings statements, essentially things that are looking backwards and manipulated in lots of ways, and very static views of the world. Operating in an environment where we are swimming in data that can actually tell us things that are going on right now with a very high degree of fidelity and granularity. But there's a massive gap, and this is true for finance, it's true for government, it's true in all walks of life. There's a massive gap between the data that is becoming available and the application of that data to our business processes. And I think companies that can help bridge that gap will also be a category that will be extremely valuable to the industry.
And that's on both sides. That's on the front, back office,
Absolutely.
institution side, as well as obviously the
Yes.
consumer side.
Yep.
Larry, any thoughts on what's been mentioned as far as the hot spots, the hot areas that you're looking at or that Goldman's looking at?
Look, I think we're always looking. And I meet with companies all the time that, and look, I think a lot of times you meet with them and sometimes you say, well, you know what, they're not right for us. I could see how they would work with American Express or somebody else that doesn't fit us. So for every, it's a lot of them. I don't even know what the number would be. There's only a few that we end up, pursuing. I'd say I leave it to these guys to kind of more come up with the ideas, and I'm more of a buyer than that I have to come up with the idea myself or what we're looking at. But we're always looking, right? And I think that's for those of you that are kind of in industry, you just have to be, have your eyes out. Now, and one thing I will say, or I don't know whether this is agreeing or not agreeing. I don't think the role of the financial advisor is dead. So with robo-advising or whatever you want to call it. But that said, there is, the financial advisors in the United States are aging out. So that population actually will just demographically retire. So there will be fewer advisors for people. And I think what technology will enable is fewer advisors to cover more clients, right? So everybody will use it. And the way we at least think is, look, at the end of the day, like when I feel sick, I go on WebMD and I look what it is, but I still go call my doctor if I think there's a problem. I think certainly at certain wealth levels, I may want to look and figure out stuff, or I may have certain portfolios that I'm willing to do, but if I'm going to do something big, I'm probably going to call my advisor.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, think about it. The age-old thing that will not change, right, is that people need permission from somewhere, right? And one of the roles of an advisor is to take and say, well, I have this experience and this knowledge, and I can help you come to giving yourself that permission on this move you want to make, right? People won't absolutely trust the technology. Advisors are aging out. There's fewer of them. Some of those areas are being replaced by technology. But at the end, I think it is just going to be a smaller population using the tools to serve the same customer base, right? No doubt on that. I agree completely. But the thing you have to understand about where the technology is going is that eventually we have to start really thinking and planning for the future. One of the things that attracted us to Goldman was the process, the analysis they did when they were talking to us, the questions they asked. We learned more in the initial conversations than we had in the entire time we'd been in business. And the reason is because they're looking out at the future, and you have to understand that if you've been around for 150 years, you've seen a lot of change. If you want to be around another 150 years, you're going to see even more change, right? I think that it's not something you can definitively put and say, absolutely, this technology is going to replace this or disrupt that or displace this. You have to look at it and say that these things are going to change throughout a much larger stack in much more granular ways. And so, there'll be an area of business. For us, when I got into retirement, after all of the entrepreneurial efforts I'd done, everybody thought I was an idiot, right? They're like, really? They're like, what's new? I'm like, I'm really excited about it. It's retirement planning.
It's amazing with a little gray hair.
And everybody in my world was like, I'm sorry, what? People thought it was a joke. Like, Honest Dollar was a cover company for something really cool I was going to do. But that's the thing is, all of these things will be affected by technology. None of us can predict exactly how these things will be affected. 10 years ago, we started this developer camp called the iPhone Dev Camp to develop apps on the iPhone, and everybody thought we were nuts, right? And we were telling people, you're gonna have apps and it's gonna be the central focus here, and people were just like, that is the dumbest idea we have ever heard. And we went to a bunch of companies, and none of them wanted to sponsor it because they thought it was ridiculous, right? If I would have told you 10 years ago that your phone is going to become the center of your world and the main channel of communications for entire new generations, right? It would have sounded crazy. We knew that was going to happen, but we didn't know how it was going to happen. I would have never thought, my wife would be the biggest Snapchat user on the planet, right? So I guess the point is in the same way with FinTech, we know that it is going to affect it. We know there are areas that can be affected, but it's going to be it's not something you predict and plan for in a 5-year plan, this is what we're going to do. It's something you have to watch and measure and meter every single day, because the changes are going to come up very ad hoc and almost seemingly random, and it's going to be how big banks react to those changes, or rather don't react and respond to those changes, because reactions, one's involuntary, the other's not, right? That's going to determine who the winners are overall and throughout that stack.
If you talk about the phone, the mobile phone, iPhone, was the inflection point for the mobile world kind of taking off, right? Mm-hmm. So it feels like the fintech world is really accelerating now. I mean, like you said, Adam, it's been going on for 10 or 15 years, nothing new, right? But all of a sudden, in the last couple of years, it just feels like you can't pick up the Wall Street Journal or read a newsletter or an announcement about something going on in fintech. Do you agree with that it is accelerating? And if so, why? What's been the inflection point? Is it cloud computing? Is it is it the fact that the millennials now are making money and they don't want to talk to anybody? They just want to go on their phone. What's the inflection point here?
Look, I'm going to jump on that one and say a lot of these startups aren't following any kind of regulatory compliance, right? So what's making it easy is if you go out to the valley and you go to some of these tech hubs, they're just like, right, but we can do this, right? The computer will let us get this data and we can take it and we can, and I will tell you that a majority of those are severely out of compliance.
Breaking the law.
Absolutely, right? There's no doubt. And so, but as they just put it together and it works and they put it out, then it drives this kind of hype cycle and everything's being changed. But we met with several in the early days that we thought, well, maybe we should hire these 3 or 4 or 5 guys. And we looked at it. We spent out of our initial budget almost 50% of the budget on law firms, on regulatory compliance. Okay, we had a $3 million seed. Almost half of that was on just the complexities of compliance. In what we were doing, different states had different privacy laws. Were we taking information, making sure that we're completely in order? And we've talked to dozens of companies where they're like, right, but we just wrote the software and then it does it. And it's like, well, that's not how this industry works at all. I'd say that there's this increase in the amount of options. Therefore, there's more coverage and there's more people hiring their PR firms and buzz. We're kind of in this big hype cycle of it. But the fact is, some of it's not real, some of it's not regulatory compliant, and some of it is going to change the world. And it's up to Larry and I at Goldman and the team we work with to try to figure out who that is and how we position for that.
You were shaking your head on about the inflection point in
Yeah,
cloud computing, or
Yeah, so all true, but I think the driver of it, if there's one driver, to me, it's Amazon. That has lowered the barrier to entry to create any kind of company, to build software, and it's the combination of Amazon then plus emergence of standardized software stacks, of the open source movement, of the ability of development. This is obscure, but development frameworks that essentially allow you to snap together software extremely quickly, which is allowing exactly the type of behavior that Hurley said. And yes, healthcare, financial services are special cases because of regulatory issues. And so there are braking forces, but the acceleration to me is driven. There's one word: it's Amazon.
And where does regulatory issues go? I mean, we're sitting at we just heard for the first.
So, what's something that's very interesting, and not in the U.S., but if you look at Singapore, if you look at London, there are a number of others that are escaping me right now. There are governments saying actively saying we're going to give fintechs a free pass for a while. We're going to let them do their thing, and we'll watch them. And we will not. We'll let them play because we want to see how this plays out, and then we'll see how we want to regulate this. The U.S. is not taking that approach at this point, but other countries are saying this industry is going to be disrupted. Regulation is only going to get in the way of that. Let's actually deliberately and publicly back off, and that's an interesting approach that might be worth watching. There's also lots of ways around. Regulation is used, frankly, by large institutions and individuals in large institutions as an excuse not to change. Yes, there's regulation. Yes, you have to do things right. Most of that regulation, it may be burdensome, but it was done with good intention, which is usually, hopefully, to protect the end consumer of financial services. There are ways to comply with it. There are ways to go around it. There are ways to partner in order to be compliant. It's not that bad. And so, frankly, I see regulation more, as I said, as an political excuse internally by large institutions who don't want to take risk and would rather keep their 1,000 people than have to deal with the disruption than actually a real reason not to get things done.
Do you agree with that, Larry?
I'd say yes and no. I mean, I think, look, regulation is real. I mean, we deal with it, and it's just, it's something we do have to deal with. And it's a challenge, right? So, I joke, with Hurley, Hurley, we give him a problem, he'll run with a laptop, and in 6 hours come back with a solution. At Goldman Sachs, it's a team of 20 people in 2 months. Now, the problem is, when Hurley comes up with that solution, to the extent we want to integrate it, I still need that team of, because it has to integrate into our solution. Now, that said, is that a hindrance? It's we're not saying no to change, but that said, it is something we have to deal with. And I think, look, as this industry continues to expand and grow, it's something we deal with and talk about and struggle with. Look, and we talk a little bit about machine learning and different things that could happen there. I mean, how do regulators stay ahead of something that's constantly getting smart? It's very hard in the U.S. construct to work around. I mean,
so let me give you a very specific
example
example though of where it's used as a instinctive defense mechanism as opposed to a real thing. So one of the reasons why banks are so slow or relatively slow compared to other industries to adopt technology is because of the fear of cloud computing, and the blanket statement, or from a lot of industries that say we are never putting data onto a cloud. Right? They'll make that statement. Really? Where your buildings are not on the cloud. The email addresses of your employees are not on the cloud. There is already lots of data on the cloud. I had dinner with the head of one of the world's largest private banks, so a European private bank, who was so frustrated with his own. It's a Swiss company, so they have very strict privacy regulations. And he goes, I have all these privacy regulations. I spend all this money on not letting data out, and some employee sells a DVD of data to the German government so they can chase us on taxes, I might as well just put everything out there. This was the head of one of the world's largest private banks saying, recognizing the world has changed, but either the regulation hasn't caught up, or the fact is that it's easier for a compliance officer just to say no than to actually be thoughtful and go like, you know what, that stuff doesn't matter. This stuff is actually private and needs to stick. And making those finer distinctions takes some work. But once you do that work, then there are actually very substantial benefits that an institution can realize by being a little bit more thoughtful and willing to challenge the status quo.
Well, and then that I totally agree, and that's part of the reason out of the options that we went with Goldman, right?
Yes.
Everybody thought that I was going to have the biggest issue with compliance, and legal. And it's actually not. It's actually, I probably disagree with the technology department more than anybody. But the compliance people are being very thoughtful, both throughout the process of the acquisition. But those ideas Larry says, run off with the laptop for 6 hours and pull them up. They are heard, they are evaluated, and all I need as an engineer is for compliance to tell me, right, but these 3 things don't work, and I can go re-engineer those, right? And I think that's what makes the kind of symbiotic relationship we have so strong.
So, and then, to your original thing, Jere, like, why is it I think one of the reasons it is accelerating is, banks like Goldman and JP Morgan and Fidelity here, are embracing technology, right? I mean, we all, I think, whereas maybe a few years ago, or I don't know how many you want to go back, people were maybe a little bit reluctant. Everybody recognizes we have to do this. This is not like this for our survival. I mean, let alone to be around for another 150 years. For us to be around another 10 years, we have to embrace this. We have to change. And we're all working towards that. But it's not easy. But we're all working towards it.
So before we open up to the audience, because we want a few minutes of questions, I got one last question. With technology comes efficiency. With efficiency sometimes comes taking jobs out of the equation. We have a lot of different people in here that are advisors, traders, investment bankers, analysts. Where's the biggest risk? If I'm an analyst, should I be worried? If I'm an advisor, where do you think the biggest risks are? Where does this fintech start eliminating these jobs over the next decade?
I'm not.
Or does it create jobs?
I'm not worried about their jobs. I'm worried about mine. I mean, realistically, because of the regulatory complexity, because of the way machine learning is evolving, you are starting to have programs that write programs. You can codify things like regulations, right? And so I actually, will advisors be affected? Sure. Will wealth managers, all these people, all of this stuff will be affected. How, I don't know, probably fairly dramatically. I agree with Larry, it'll be fewer people serving the same stuff using the tools. I worry about my job, though, most of all. Because if you think about it, as finance becomes so dependent upon technology, which already is, and as technology becomes such a disruptor, as we've been saying, for that industry, then the controls on the code, on that technology are going to need to be automated. And so there are already companies out there who have, Google has software writing software. There's a company who just makes software to write software, who's looking at 3 verticals, right? They're looking at like air safety and finance and biotech. And so when you start looking at these really critical things, at what point do you no longer trust me to write the software because it has become somewhat commoditized, because it has become somewhat normalized, and do computers replace my job, right, in fintech, right? So that's actually something nobody talks about that actually concerns me more than, no offense, any of you, because I'm not an advisor, and I know, but literally, technology will automate many people out of a job. The thing technologists don't see coming, I believe, is it will automate them out of a job potentially first in several areas.
Any thoughts?
Look, I think that there will be a large amount of displacement of jobs up and down the stack. If your job essentially consists of looking at a spreadsheet and moving data to another spreadsheet, that's not, and you're being paid a handsome 6-figure salary for that, you should probably be thinking about changing your skill set. I heard an estimate earlier this week that there was $100 billion a year being spent by banks on compliance.
$100 billion.
$100 billion a year,
on compliance.
which I believe, having
Me too.
right across the industry. probably 70% of that can go away or be automated, my guess, maybe more. Is that actually, when you step back and say for society, is that actually a bad thing? Probably not. That's probably a pretty good thing. That those people are actually doing something other than, watching other people and so on. So when you step back and you say, on the whole, this is actually potentially a good thing for society, or at least not bad. At the micro level, if it's your job and you're in that stack, it looks threatening. But we've also seen with every disruption, with every displacement, there are new jobs coming along that nobody even thought might exist before that disruption. And your example of how many iPhone app developers are there today? That was the idea that got you laughed out of the room 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Great. All right, so let's open up to the audience. Questions out there?
How is CSOM integrating FinTech learning into their curriculum? And then is there a geographic hotspot for FinTech development other than the Valley, or is it Boston? Is it the Research Triangle? Is it Boston?
Boston and Austin both, I would agree. Austin because, a lot of people don't know, but Schwab moved most of their developers into the old Tivoli campus. And those guys are like, Austin's great, I should go work at a startup. So we used to joke at Honest Dollar when they first made that move. It was the Honest Dollar recruitment program was we won't have to pay relocation for literally our choice of hundreds of engineers from Schwab. But there's a lot going on in Austin, in lending, in retirement, in checking and savings, and all kind of factors. I think it's definitely emerged. There's been all the way back since CyberTrader was acquired by Schwab. There's, I think, 30 new companies doing this new laws that allow you to go and do crowdsourcing finance. There's a ton of activity there and here as well. I actually don't see the Valley as being the leader in FinTech. And globally, London is clearly way ahead, I think, of everyone. Exactly, especially for institutional. Absolutely.
And from the Carroll School of Management, I'm not the expert to talk about it, and we can hear later from Andy or Ronnie Saka, but I can tell you a lot's going on. First of all, at the Shea Center, we're trying to cultivate the whole culture of startups, and so a lot has been done there. There's been a lot of time spent on data analytics and big data, and that's going to be a lot of that stuff's happening now. Also, we got a great computer science department here. A lot of really smart students doing a lot of computer courses in coding, information sciences. So I think the Carroll School is spending a lot of time on this. My role is to try to cultivate the culture, and with the entrepreneurship side of it. That combined with what's going on, in the classroom, I think you'll see some pretty cool things. So, John.
So one of the big issues in the 401k world is the leakage, right? So particularly with the millennial generation, people changing jobs constantly, and there's no real system, there's no automated system that I'm aware of to deal with this portability issue of people taking their 401k money, small balances, right? A 32-year-old might have $25,000 in their 401k money, but when they go to the next company, they've got to deal with the human resources and forms and paper, and they just say, just give me money. And so there's billions of dollars taken out of the 401k system every year because there's no real systematic way of processing portability from one company to another.
Well, there were two big issues when we first started on Honest Dollar we looked at. Was that, and last year was the first year of net outflows out of the 401ks, right? Because of the boomers. So yes, that's all going to put stress onto that system. As far as portability goes, obviously they just need Honest Dollar accounts. Problem solved. But that was one of the things we looked at, and one of the things we looked at early on was, could we be using the technology we created a way to do exactly that and become like, here's how you make it portable. You're leaving this company, you take it out of the 401k, you put it into this Honest Dollar platform, and then it doesn't matter anymore because it's effectively an IRA, right? And the thing there that we ran into was everybody said, right, but my 401k is letting me put away all of this money. But if you actually went and looked at it, especially in the market we were looking at, people weren't even coming anywhere near any of those limits, right? So portability is a huge issue. It's absolutely something that needs to be addressed.
go to this side of the room. Second row.
I just had a question from Honest Dollar. By the time you're offering 401k programs to a lot of individuals, as you point out, after you take out your service fees, what sort of returns are they having? Is it something
Well, we're offering IRAs.
IRAs.
Right.
Good. So what about returns after your service charges? How are you doing?
Well, our charge is a flat $5 a month, right? So it depends, on how much, on where they're at. So what you want to think is if there's a bunch of people that don't have a lot of money, they're not saving, then that all of a sudden looks higher, right, on average. But the fact is that it's not just Lyft drivers, it's independent graphic artists, people who are doing software program independently, things like that, who are actually putting away a lot more. And in that case, then obviously it looks much better on that other side.
So where are the investment? How are you making the investments?
So they're put into Vanguard funds. So they have 6 portfolios across Vanguard funds, and it's pretty self-explanatory from there.
Okay.
Are you a fiduciary on the account?
We are a fiduciary. I say that. Do you see how I say that as a software guy? Yes. Well, there's no plan level, right? It's an IRA. That's correct.
But yeah, David.
This would be thank you. This would be a question, I think, either for Larry or Bill. Within the next 10 years, and I know no one can really predict the future, at what dollar level and above, or what dollar level and below would personal financial planners become like landlines? Is it $500,000? Is it, I just use the landline because I don't think any of us ever thought that they could become as useless as they are, really.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't know that we have the answer, right? I mean, I'm just saying, I think there are, when I think about people within our client network that we, currently cover, certainly, through our ACO business, there are probably people there who are, maybe have 50,000 in the bank and require a lot of hand-holding, and there are people with, 500,000 that actually would be fine. Part of it depends a little bit. I mean, I think part of it ultimately will depend on the complexity of your account, right? So
So it's more the complexity of the individual's financial situation,
Correct.
rather than the dollar level of their
correct.
assets.
So if you're, a single, man or woman living in New York City, and you just really don't have any, then you don't need a lot of help. But if if you're married and you have a couple of trusts and you have maybe multiple residents, then it gets more complicated and then you need help.
Okay, thank you.
I think we have one more question. Right here in the.
Can anyone give us a comment on the bricks and mortars at the bank level, commercial banks? Are we going to go through the same thing as happening in the retail generally, and lots of those, we're not going to have a bank around the corner anymore?
So
Al, you wanna give it a
Well, I don't. Who knows? I mean, we've been having that exact conversation. Let's face it, for 20 years since the first .com thing. Right? There will be no more. Why do you need a bank branch anymore? And yet they're still here. And in fact, the branch network is seen as pretty valuable by those big commercial banks, although they're expensive. I don't see it changing anytime fast, and probably a rising interest rate. If we see interest rates rising and banks starting to make money again, if there's deregulation, then any pressure, the cost pressures will be off. So I don't see that changing. The nature of the services delivered and the cost models delivered in those branches might change, which you're already seeing. More kiosks and remote advisors and things like that. But for some reason, the branch seems to still be a pretty valuable asset.
Well, we could go on and on, but it is lunch, and I know that I would lose my job if I didn't get us out of here on time. So I've learned to be on time for lunch. Thank you so much. This was really great. I mean, we really a lot of really interesting things.